There are many games throughout the years that have often been almost universally considered as some of the best games of all time. I'm talking about games like Ocarina of Time, Red Dead Redemption 2, and even as recently as Baldur's Gate 3. Games that the vast majority of people admit are amazing, even if it might not be their cup of tea. You'll notice that it's a pretty small group of companies that typically stay within this conversation when it comes to these landmark releases. Nintendo, Rockstar, From Software, Square Enix, Capcom, and Naughty Dog, just to name a few. But if I had to point to one company who may have the highest batting average for phenomenal releases, it has to be Valve. Team Fortress 2, Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, every single Counter-Strike and Half-Life game, but there is one game that I think most people hold in even higher regard. A game that when it came out, critics and audiences adored, and has turned out to be a massive financial success. A game that people are still playing to this day and has an incredibly dedicated community. I'm of course talking about possibly the greatest game that anyone has ever played, Sorry, I couldn't say that one with a straight face. It's Portal 2. Portal 2, do I have some stories about this one? Portal 2 was one of the first games that helped me break away from my Call of Duty obsession back in 2011. 2011 was such a banger year for video games that I was finally willing to stop playing Black Ops for a bit to enjoy some different games, with the primary culprits being Portal 2, Mortal Kombat, Batman Arkham City, and well, they weren't all winners. I, being in high school at the time, only really had a PS3 to play games with, and I was surprised to see that Portal 2 was actually getting a release for it. I picked it up a few months after it launched, made my very first Steam account, how's that for a throwback, and what I enjoyed with Portal 1, man, it didn't even compare with what I was playing with Portal 2. Everything, and I mean everything, was a step up. The graphics, the voice acting, the bigger story, the new puzzle elements, the fucking multiplayer, god, it was all so good. I played the single player story, and when it came to the cooperative chambers, these would be something I would revisit a few times over the years with a couple of different friends. After I made the transition over to PC gaming, this was one of the first games I picked up since it costs less to buy this game than it does to get a meal at Taco Bell now. Portal 2 is a game that I hold near and dear to my heart, and if I'm being honest, it might be my favorite game that I've covered on this channel up until this point. With that being said, I do expect this video to go a little bit longer than my first Portal video. Given that Portal 2 is a much longer game, that's kind of to be expected, but I was also really surprised to learn just how much more in-depth Portal 2's development really was than the first game. Portal 2's development began immediately after wrapping up the original game. This time around, there were going to be a few changes. First and foremost, Portal 2 was being developed to be a standalone title. Second, the development team behind Portal was essentially multiplied by 5 times. There were a few developers who were pulled off to help with development for Left 4 Dead, but they typically brought back more help upon their return, and it was a great learning experience for developing Portal 2's co-op. More on that in a bit. So as weird as this might sound, the original plan for Portal 2 actually didn't have any portals at all, which is strange. That'd be like if Team Fortress 2 only had a free-for-all game mode, or if there were no zombies in Left 4 Dead, or if Artifact had no cultural or historical significance. Okay, that's the last Artifact joke of the review, I promise. Instead of having portals, there was some sort of mechanic called f-stop that the player would utilize. This would have them use the camera to take a picture of an item, and then be able to rotate it or scale that picture to bring it into the real world. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Superliminal if anybody has played that game, and it's a really cool concept, one that I definitely think has a lot more potential, but due to people asking the somewhat valid question, why is this game called Portal 2 if there are no portals? The team decided to switch directions very early on in development. With the readjustment to focus on the mechanics that Valve knew, it was time to refine what already worked with Portal. The design philosophy for introducing mechanics in a safe environment before testing the player with the consequences of failure was again the backbone behind designing the game's many test chambers. The test chambers were originally drawn on a whiteboard from an isometric perspective that actually kind of foreshadows a little bit what the game's level builder was going to look like, but more on that in a bit. Portal 2 wasn't designed to be difficult, but instead be just challenging enough that it felt rewarding for the players to complete each of its tests. There was also some streamlining involved to give players immediate feedback on finding a solution to a puzzle, such as replacing the energy balls from the first game with instantaneous lasers. Another new addition was with the repulsion gels, that Valve actually took inspiration from the DigiPen Institute of Technology's game, Tag: The Power of Paint. In this game, the player would use the paint gun to paint different surfaces with colors that would allow them to do different things in order to solve puzzles. Much like Narbacular Drop a few years ago, Valve hired the developers from Tag and implemented their ideas into this new game. One of the most requested features of Portal 2 was actually to also add a cooperative experience, given that a common practice during development was for a couple of people to gather around and talk about how to solve the puzzles together. With Valve also working on Left 4 Dead at the time, and in some cases even sharing developers, a decision was made that this would be a worthwhile addition. This may have actually been one of the more tricky aspects of the game to design, however. These chambers would really test the players as they were built with the fundamental understanding that you would have to work together in order to clear every single chamber. This will require some pretty extensive testing to ensure that one player couldn't complete any chamber without the help of their partner. Given the mode's need for communication, when something nonverbal was an option, there was also a ping system in place in order to help with that issue. When it came to the story, there was also a lot of different concepts thrown around. One thing that Valve was sure of: this needed to be bigger. And bigger it was, but it was still designed around the idea of having a small cast of characters and the greater emphasis put on the comedic writing. The team originally thought about keeping with Portal's tone, but decided to flex their comedic muscles a little bit by including a lot more humor and witty writing to the mix. The game apparently had some joke endings before too, but were ultimately cut due to them requiring too much effort for them to develop for what would probably be something that most people wouldn't care too much about. There are actually a couple things cut from this game's story too, such as Shell speaking, meeting a lost tribe of animalistic turrets. Hell, the co-op mode story was supposed to be way more intricate, but since players were often talking with each other over the dialogue, it was scaled back significantly. The setting was originally completely different too. Apparently, Portal 2 was originally going to be a prequel where the players would fight off Aperture CEO Cave Johnson, as his consciousness was implemented into an AI as he controls an army of robots to destroy the player. During the playtesting, many were not pleased with the lack of GLaDOS or Shell, causing Portal 2 to be reconcepted as a sequel. And again, just like in my Portal video, there's a bunch of anecdotal things you can find with the development of Portal 2. Things like how Portal 2's narrative are connected with the Greek story of Prometheus, or even how some of the personality cores were originally based off of characters from like Shawshank Redemption. There's a lot to dig into here. Portal 2 was officially announced in early March 2010 from an issue of Game Informer. The days before the official announcement, there was a patch put out for Portal 1 that included some hints to form an ARG hinting at the sequel. I didn't really follow this at the time, but from what I gathered, there were some new sound effects that were being played over the radio that would essentially hint towards GLaDOS rebooting. Shortly after that, another patch was put out where it altered the first game's ending. Instead of a fade to black, Shell would be dragged off by an unseen mechanical hand. Over the next few months, some more information would come out from various events, such as Gabe Newell's acceptance speech at the Game Developers Conference that hinted at more information coming at E3 2010, and at that event, the announcement of a release on the PlayStation 3. Portal 2 was released in April of 2011 to PC, Xbox 360, and PS3. And what else can you say about Portal 2 other than it's absolutely a landmark title for gaming? Portal 2 received universal praise with scores on all systems being in the mid-90s. Giant Bomb gave the score a perfect 100 and said, "Despite being so much bigger than the original, I actually felt a little melancholy once Portal 2 was over, simply because it's so rare to find a game this smart, this funny, and this rich with detail." While Game Trailers gave the game a slightly lower score of 90 and said, "Just like its predecessor, this sequel manages to wring every last ounce of enjoyment out of a seemingly simple core concepts. If you're strictly into action, its slow, plotting, calculated pace will be a turnoff, yet somehow Valve has managed to make a puzzle game that will make your pulse rise with a never-ending daisy chain of positive reinforcement." The game was most definitely a commercial success for Valve too, being the second best-selling game of April 2011, only coming in behind Mortal Kombat. Gabe Newell will go on to say in an interview in May of 2012 that Portal 2 had sold over 4 million copies. However, that number only grew as VG Insights currently reports the game has sold over 27 million copies on Steam alone, which, like I said in my Portal video, you have to imagine is a bit higher given that doesn't include console sales. Talking about accolades, I quickly want to highlight a few other games that came out in 2011. Arkham City, Dark Souls, Skyrim, Minecraft, Uncharted 3, Terraria, Mario 3D Land, Skyward Sword, Modern Warfare 3, Mario Kart 7, Battlefield 3, and Mortal Kombat. 2011 was a stacked as fuck year for gaming. So for Portal 2 to not only consistently rank highly amongst them, but often as the overall winner was no easy feat. Portal 2 took numerous awards for Best Narrative, Audio, Game Design, Multiplayer, Male and Female Performance, PC Game, DLC, and several overall Game of the Year awards, making it by far one of the most decorated games of that year. Of course, things didn't stop there for Portal 2, as the game received a number of post-launch updates, both official and fan-made. On the official side of things, Valve included a motion control update for the PlayStation Move and Razer Hydra, if any remembers that existing. There was also an additional set of cooperative test chambers added to the end of the cooperative campaign that really puts Portal players' knowledge to the tests. And finally, an update that added a map editor allowing the community to create and share their own creations. And speaking of the community, the modding scene for Portal 2 isn't necessarily massive, but what is there is absolutely extraordinary. You have Thinking with Time Machines and Portal Reloaded, both with different focuses on time travel based puzzles, but you also have Portal Stories Mel and the recently released Portal Revolution, which is about as close as we're going to get to seeing Portal 3 in our lifetimes. If these mods are something that you guys would really like to see me cover in the future, please be sure to comment down below. From the outside looking in, it looks like Valve did an absolutely remarkable job when it came to stepping up what worked with Portal 1 and bringing it to its sequel. But what do I think? I mean, it's been over a decade since I last played this game single player, and the multiplayer was only something I ever did sporadically. So is this game even as good as I remember it being? Does it even deserve to be called one of the best games of all time? Yeah. Portal 2 was a game that I always had deep appreciation for and look back on fondly, but I never felt like I had to play the game again, you know? Like, I played the game initially in 2011, loved everything about it, and moved on. I'd like to think that I'm a little bit more seasoned now and able to evaluate and appreciate games in a different way, and upon revisiting Portal 2, I am kicking myself for not playing this more regularly. Nearly everything that was established in Portal 1 has been refined, expanded upon, and increased in volume from the first game. The presentation took a notable step up with several new environments to explore, an even better soundtrack, and several new voice actors added to the cast. With those new voice actors, the rosters of characters extended, and were given more screen time given the game's longer narrative and larger scope. The writing took a more humorous approach and had so many memorable moments chalked in its 5-hour runtime. And then there's the gameplay. The winning formula remains the same, but so many new puzzle components were added. Plus the addition of co-op and a level editor, the community can create their own test chambers and share them on the Steam Workshop. This was just an improvement in nearly every single way. And shit, even the things that I would say I still preferred with Portal 1 would probably just be subjective qualities. I'm not gonna lie, I'm really excited to talk about this game. It's been so long since I last played this game that everything I played almost felt like I was experiencing it again for the first time. And I have to say, the appreciation that I have for this game has only gotten stronger. I don't want to waste any more time, we have a lot to discuss today. So, without further ado, this is my review of Portal 2. Hey, that rhymed. If the most striking visuals in the first Portal game was its use of sleek whites of its many test chambers, then Portal 2's biggest contributions to the aesthetic of Aperture Labs is how it deviates from that expectation. Portal 1's second half was all about contrasting the first. And for the people who like that, you'll be happy to know that it's been greatly expanded upon. You still do have the pure white test chambers, but now you also have the chambers that have been overgrown with vegetation and erosion, the chambers that have been haphazardly smashed together, and the testing areas from a bygone era to add an even greater level of contrast. With the game's updated visuals, these spring even closer to the forefront. Now with the game's environment seeing a facelift, a lot of the particle effects around the portals were given the same treatment. The lasers, repulsion gels, tractor beams, light bridges, these are all instantly identifiable when entering a test chamber thanks to the contrast that they provide with the area, and it serves as immediate information to the player in order to get their brains thinking. The animations also saw a massive improvement. In my first Portal video, I never really touched on the animations because, I mean, what was there to say? You really only saw GLaDOS spin around in the room and Shell's static character model through the portals. The most character provided by the animations may have actually come from either the turrets or the personality cores. It was really that limited. Most of the characterization came through dialogue, which, don't get me wrong, worked great for that game, but with the added production values that Portal 2 has, the animation department saw a massive improvement. This is most obviously seen with the characters such as Wheatley and GLaDOS. They are incredibly expressive for things that only have one eye and no mouth. The way that Wheatley blinks and nods his head up and down are simplistic, yes, but they also go a really long way in having him be more expressive in his delivery. Same goes for GLaDOS when she rails towards Shell almost like a snake. She becomes very intimidating. Atlas and Peabody in the cooperative mode are also some great examples, given that the only noises that they make are some vague machine-like bleeps and bloops. Because of that, their characters are fully told through their animations. Whether it's dancing, high-fiving, or giving each other a hug, these little robots might be actually some of the most carefree and happy-go-lucky characters in Portal 2, and they do all of that without saying a single word. These animations of course extend past our main characters too, as some of the objects and even the environment itself has been refitted to provide their own voice to the conversation. Probably my favorite example is the way that Aperture Labs now moves around like it's a living, breathing character. I know this is usually the result of someone else influencing what is going on, but seeing the animations from the first game go from as limited as some stairs being raised to whole walls and structures either repairing or destroying one another is such an upgrade. And also, one of my favorite creations is the turret cube hybrids. These things just scream I shouldn't be alive, but they still provide a laugh to me every single time I see them. Next thing to cover is the voice acting. I mean, what else can you say other than it's also phenomenally done? Of course, Ellen McLain comes back as GLaDOS, and she again does a spectacular job, this time showing an even wider range of emotion at the cost of some of the cold-hearted, autonomized interactions in the first game. I'll get a little bit more into the characterization of GLaDOS in the story section because trust me, there's a reason that she takes this route, but just know that Ellen McLain once again hits it out of the park. Stephen Merchant voices Wheatley, and once again, he's fantastic. Wheatley has an even wider range than GLaDOS, and while he never reaches the heights that GLaDOS does, the delivery is so frantic and humorous that he carves out his own spot in being a good foil to GLaDOS, even when the story calls for them to mirror one another. Finally, there's J.K. Simmons as Cave Johnson, and I think if anyone remembers anything about the characters in this game, it's with him. A large part of that is due to the absolutely hilarious writing, but the delivery is also perfect. J.K. Simmons plays Cave Johnson with this bravado and gusto that one would typically associate from a large-scale businessman of an older time, like a Howard Hughes or something. The comedic timing is fantastic. When he gets into a rant, you can feel the passion. And when he starts to succumb to illness, you honestly feel a little bit bad for the guy, even though he's portrayed as a total jerk. The voice acting wasn't the only thing in the audio department that got an upgrade, as the OST saw another massive improvement. First and foremost, this soundtrack is a lot more varied. It is primarily electronic based, but while the first game mainly stuck to space ambiance, progressive electronic, and electro-industrial elements, this OST adds a number of new genres to the mix. We get some IDM, some drone, some power noise, some glitch, techno, some minimalism, breakbeat. Hell, we even get a few tracks that step into classical territory. One of the standout songs in my opinion is one of the tracks that ends the game, Cara Mia Audio, an opera actually performed by Ellen McLain. Of course, you also have the Indie-tronica-inspired final tracks with Want You Gone and Exile Vilify that are also some standouts. Nothing quite as popular is still alive, but very good nevertheless. In order to have the OST enhance what the player was doing, there was actually some procedurally generated elements added to the arrangements to reflect actions that were going on in game. For example, if you were to step on a bounce pad, the music would ramp up in volume and give a soaring-like atmosphere until the player landed. If you were to run along the orange gel, there would be a speed ramping section added to highlight the intensity. And if you were to go into one of the tractor beam, the music would sound muffled with some new ethereal-like sounds being added to fit the vibe. As the player progresses through the chamber, these arrangements would start to become more and more full until the puzzle was complete. Again, this provides excellent feedback to the player in an immediate fashion to show they're on the right track towards completing any given chamber. So it should be pretty obvious by now that there have been some massive additions to both the audio and visual department of this game. But if I can point to one thing that was improved from Portal 1 to Portal 2, it has to be the scope of the story and also how it was told. Alright, so let's start with that plot summary. So we first wake up in another status test chamber, where we are immediately given a tutorial on the basics of movement. Right away, Portal 2 shows that its tone is far more humorous than its predecessor, with us marveling at some art, then with our interactions by meeting Wheatley, a personality core who has come to check on us. We have been in stasis for an unknown amount of time, and along with Wheatley, we plan on making our way out of Aperture Labs, but we have to go through some dilapidated test chambers from the first game. I think this section of the game is pretty cool since you really get a feeling for how much time has passed as you complete these test chambers. After making our way through, we eventually find GLaDOS' old chamber, and by some stupid mistakes made by Wheatley, we reactivate her. To say that she's happy to see us would kinda be true, I guess you could say, as GLaDOS separates us from Wheatley and drops us into testing chambers as she begins to repair the facility. The next couple of sections of the game sees us travel through Aperture Labs as GLaDOS repairs the area bit by bit in an almost organic-like way with a healthy dose of fucking with Shell here and there.
Oh, did I accidentally fizzle that before you could complete the test? I'm sorry.
Man, GLaDOS is so passive-aggressive in this game, I love it. We make our way through a few test chambers until Wheatley finds us and we make our escape. In order to get out of Aperture Labs for good, we'll need to disable the automated turrets and the neurotoxin gas, and then confront GLaDOS once and for all. And we do just that, with the final blow to GLaDOS being that we perform a core transfer, putting Wheatley in GLaDOS' place. Wheatley begins to send us on our way, putting an end to Portal 2.
Actually, why do we have to leave right now?
Or so you thought. No, immediately after Wheatley gets put into power, he begins to go a little crazy. He puts GLaDOS' consciousness into a potato battery, which was referenced a little earlier in the game, it still makes me laugh, and she reveals that Wheatley's whole existence was to essentially dumb down GLaDOS as he was an intelligence dampening sphere. Being offended by this, Wheatley destroys the lift that we are standing on and sends us careening down into the deepest parts of the lab's abandoned facilities. We finally land in what appears to be the remnants of what Aperture Labs used to be. And the next section of the game is not only one of my favorites from a gameplay perspective, but from a narrative one as well. So as we make our way through the old facility, we get automated messages from a man by the name of Cave Johnson. These recordings shed a lot of light about the history of Aperture in many ways, while also being very humorous. We learned that Aperture was once a very well-respected scientific entity, using some of the top bodies and minds that society had to offer conducting their tests. Well, as the years would pass, Aperture would slowly lose more and more footing and eventually have to resort to homeless people and even their own employees to do their incredibly cruel and slightly comedic tests. During this adventure, we do eventually save Potato GLaDOS from a bird, and she accompanies us through Old Aperture. Interestingly enough, Cave Johnson's assistant, Carolyn, has a very similar voice to GLaDOS, and even some of their dialogue is the same. Well, it's not the biggest twist in the world, but nearing the end of our time in Old Aperture, Cave Johnson reveals that he was poisoned after ingesting some moonrock dust, which he used to make the portable surfaces that we've been seeing everywhere, and he is terminally ill. In a last-ditch effort to preserve Aperture, he requests that Carolyn's consciousness be transferred into an advanced computer capable of running Aperture after his death. This news troubles GLaDOS in a way that we have not seen from her character up until this point. After arriving back in modern-day Aperture, we can see what Wheatley has done with the place.
Explosion imminent. Evacuate the facility immediately.
I thought I'd fix that.
Warning. Reactor core is at critical.
There, fixed.
While one thing is concerning is the state of disarray that Aperture has fallen into, as the facility is essentially on a course for implosion. Wheatley, being bored with his weird turret cube thingies, takes us as prisoners in order to complete tests. Wheatley, also not being as proficient in making tests as GLaDOS, has us do very basic things or slap together remnants of GLaDOS' own tests. Wheatley almost gets this euphoric pleasure out of watching us complete these tests, though over time that joy starts to wear off as he tries desperately to give us increasing challenges and danger in order to maintain that high. Nearing the end of this chapter, Wheatley foreshadows a surprise which ultimately results in us putting him in a death trap. Oh thank god, we were only a few test chambers away from having Wheatley ask us to choke him in the shower or some shit to try to keep that euphoria going. So it's nice that he's just trying to kill us now. Wheatley reveals that he has found 2 robots from the cooperative campaign and that he no longer needs Shell, so it's time to dispose of her. The final section of the game sees us making it to Wheatley, having a boss battle where we add some of the corrupted personality cores to force another core exchange, get booby-trapped after we try to initiate the transfer, before finally shooting the fucking moon with a portal gun to get Wheatley sucked into the vacuum of space.
Space!
That shit was so badass. We almost go along with Wheatley, but thankfully GLaDOS, now back in control of her body, has a change of heart and actually saves us. The final scene of the game has GLaDOS sharing with us that she finally understands what it means to be human after finding Carolyn inside of herself.
Carolyn deleted.
Goodbye, Carolyn.
Before deleting Carolyn permanently. And before you can say, oh shit, here we go again, GLaDOS lets us go. Ah, see, I knew she actually had a change of heart. Well, I mean, she paints it as killing us takes too much work, but hey, a win's a win in my book. GLaDOS shuttled us out of the facility, and so ends Portal 2. Or so you thought. No, we still have a whole cooperative campaign to go through, but as I said earlier, there isn't much of a story here since players would often be communicating with each other rather than listening to the narrative. So the co-op story actually takes place after the single-player campaign ends, where you and a friend take control over 2 robots by the names of Atlas and Peabody. You are essentially tasked with completing test chambers and recovering data disks. During this journey, GLaDOS is initially excited about having some non-human test subjects, but starts to miss human nature more and more to the point where she's trying to pull it out of our 2 robots through prodding and taunts. Eventually, GLaDOS instructs the 2 robots to find an area called the Vault, which they do, and they find out that it contains several thousands of humans that GLaDOS can use for further testing. And then so ends Portal 2's cooperative campaign. But wait, there's more. Yep, not too long after Portal 2 was released, there was a DLC campaign for the cooperative mode. Alright, I'll make this one quick. So essentially GLaDOS wakes up our 2 robots a very long time after she burns through all the human test subjects. And by a long time, I mean about a week. What the hell was she doing with these people? Anyway, apparently there is someone inside Aperture sabotaging the facility, and GLaDOS needs us to become killing machines to dispatch of them. After making our way through some of the most challenging test chambers yet, we find the culprit, the bird from the single player that was trying to eat GLaDOS that has been pecking at various keys this whole time. This sends GLaDOS into a panic as she believes everything is doomed, but Atlas and Peabody end up shooing the bird away, leaving behind its eggs. GLaDOS eventually ends up hatching the eggs and begins to raise the baby birds as her own killing machines. And so ends Portal 2's story. For real this time, sorry to keep this bit running. So Portal 2's story is often regarded as one of gaming's absolute best, but given the events that I just listed out, it doesn't seem like anything was really that mold-breaking, you know? The way the plot progresses is pretty obvious, it's a pretty standard story of 2 enemies uniting to take out a common threat, so what is it about Portal's story that actually makes it that special? Well, let's talk about some of the things I already touched on in my Portal 1 video and how they show up in Portal 2. So firstly, the environmental storytelling is once again present and has been expanded upon in even more ways. Seeing the first containment area break open and to have the size of aperture shown to us gives us a very scary implication on how many other test subjects are here, and then to immediately see the overgrown nature infesting the facility shows us just how much time has really passed. We also see a number of new drawings from Ratman again, detailing the events from Portal 1, as well as further allusions to his role in the overall story. These are something that can be explored a little bit more with the Lab Rat supplemental comic, which I highly recommend giving it a read. Link to that in the description. If foreshadowing your thing, oh boy do we have some stuff to cover. Favorite example has to be right before Shell and Wheatley confront GLaDOS after dismantling her turrets and her neurotoxin. We stumble upon this display in Aperture showing that there was a Bring Your Daughter to Work day where they showed that they were having this almost science fair type of event taking place. This set piece gives us a lot about the events happening in both the past, the present, and the future. From the past, we can infer that since these decorations weren't taken down, this event was probably on the same day that GLaDOS released the initial neurotoxin that killed most of the workers, meaning that their children were probably there too. For the present, we see that one of the potatoes that has sprouted so much that it's nearly the size of a tree, indicating how far removed from the time period we were previously. And for the future, it's an obvious foreshadowing of how GLaDOS will eventually be put into one of these said potato batteries. This isn't even going into detail about how the tone of all these things ranges from being rather humorous to being downright grim. Alright, one more example that I think hit on some interesting notes, the Oracle turret in Chapter 5. So there you are, shutting down GLaDOS' neurotoxin and turret system, when all of a sudden you find a lone turret on a conveyor belt that says, "I'm different." Well, you better believe I'm gonna go make sure I go over there and pick this thing up, and we get a ton, and I mean a ton of stuff to chew on just from this one little turret. We get some quotes from Cave Johnson foreshadowing our encounter from his messages. We get the line, "Her name is Carolyn, remember that?" which is fairly obvious. And most interestingly enough, we get a quote from Greek mythology that reads, "Prometheus was once punished by the gods by giving the gift of knowledge to man. He was cast into the bowels of earth and pecked by birds." Look, you don't need to be a world-class writer to see the connection here, but man, how much cool shit did we learn just from picking up this one little cute turret? These are just a few examples of why Valve is among the best when it comes to environmental storytelling. If you noticed another example in this game, be sure to share it down below. Now, since we were already talking a bit about the environment, how about we talk a little bit about how our setting has changed? Aperture Labs, outside of the iconic white walls of the test chambers themselves, may as well be a new location. This place has been expanded upon in an absolutely massive way, and it almost feels like its own character in a lot of ways. We get the opportunity to explore segments of the laboratory from so many different perspectives. We see it in an overgrown state as it was being rebuilt, we see it when it's fully operational, we see the new maintenance areas, we see the bottom restricted areas of the facility, we see how Aperture Labs looked and operated in the 50s and the 80s, we see the place after Wheatley's total incompetence, we see it being set to near destruction. Long story short, we see Aperture in more ways than almost any other video game setting in the span of about 5 hours, and they're all incredibly unique and well executed. Next up on our docket from things that were expanded upon is the pacing. So in Portal 1, you had what was essentially two halves. The first is the testing chambers and the second is the maintenance areas. Now this game is broken up into 9 different chapters, each about the same length of one of the halves of Portal 1's campaign, and each having a different vibe to them. All the settings I just listed pretty much change depending on the chapter. Whoever the directions might be giving you from could change between GLaDOS, Wheatley, Cave Johnson, and the first guy.
Rest assured that all lethal military androids have been taught to read and provided with one copy of the Laws of Robotics to share.
I don't know, he's just some pre-recorded message. And of course, different puzzle elements often accompany each of these chapters. The game is far longer, and it gives us a chance to spend more time in the environments we travel through, and maybe more importantly, the characters we come across. Now, the cast of characters more than doubled in the first Portal, and the ones that were here get expanded upon to an even greater degree. For returning characters, we of course have GLaDOS, who hands down gets the most development out of anyone in the game. In the first game, GLaDOS was cold, uncaring, and had a logical approach that was very much like a HAL 9000, but with a surprising addition of some more human emotions in the second half of the game, that makes her final turn to a monotonous machine in the final battle even more terrifying. This time around, GLaDOS still wants to kill us, but in the earliest parts of the game, actually takes joy in deliberately fucking with us. She'll delete parts of the test chamber, insult us, and just have an overall spiteful tone in nearly everything she does. We get a whole nother level of humanity with GLaDOS in this game, and when it's revealed that she is actually a repurposed Carolyn, it explains a lot of why GLaDOS started acting the way that she did. Of course, we have the Ratman returning in his role of leaving environmental clues, which this time around goes to show how he has a more proactive role in Portal's story than we initially thought. Finally, there is Shell, who in the most part is still pretty but that was mostly to be expected. Now, as far as new characters go, we really have 4 to look at. First, let's get the 2 more inconsequential ones out of the way, Atlas and Peabody. Being primarily featured in the cooperative campaign, they really don't have too much dialogue to dive into, with all of their communication being nonverbal. They go through a little arc of becoming more and more expressive as the campaign goes on, with the addition of new emotes that they're capable of using, but that is pretty much where it begins and ends for them. No, the 2-star of the shows for the new characters are hands down Wheatley and Cave Johnson. So Wheatley goes from being this somewhat lovable buffoon that only wishes to help Shell escape to being our primary antagonist. When he gets put into power, he is still a complete moron despite what he will have you believe. Though in the end of the game, he actually pulls off some pretty smart moves by setting traps for the players and learning from GLaDOS' previous mistakes. And I think it actually shows some pretty decent growth from him. Of course, the character that everyone remembers from this game is founder of Aperture, Cave Johnson. So much characterization from a man you see maybe a total of 3 pictures of. His character arc massively reflects the company's trajectory that Aperture Labs went through since the 50s. In many ways, he is Aperture, being the person who took it from a shower curtain manufacturer to a highly respected scientific institution bent on beating Black Mesa, to being a shell of its former self relying on performing experiments on their own employees, to finally passing away and handing over the reins for Carolyn to be transformed into GLaDOS. Cave Johnson is the most enigmatic character in this game, and that is in large part to the absolutely iconic lines of dialogue that he has throughout his chapters. Which brings me to the writing, which is totally a very distinct shift from what the original Portal has to offer. Portal 1 has its share of humor, but the jokes that were there were usually the blatant disregard to the well-being of the test subjects to a common degree of absurdity. That dark humor still exists here too, but now we get some more styles of jokes added to the mix. We have some slapstick, some insult comedy, some fourth wall jokes, and of course, many examples of dry deadpan humor as well. Pretty much all of the characters have some pretty hilarious dialogue, spouting out some of the most iconic lines and being part of situations that still get referenced today. Cave Johnson's lemon speech, GLaDOS being turned into a potato, and probably the funniest moment to me, when GLaDOS tries to get Wheatley to malfunction by giving him a paradox, but he's just too stupid to understand it, yet the turrets next to him still malfunction. That's just fucking gold right there. It should come as no surprise that I think Portal 2 took massive improvements when it came to its narrative. Nearly everything was larger in scope and was given more time to cook. And even though there was a couple things in Portal 1 that I had preferred a little bit, Portal 2 is just a massive step up in every single way. Just in case that wasn't obvious, since we've pretty much already gone over the length of my Portal 1 video, and we haven't even started talking about the gameplay yet. We really have 2 things to break down when covering Portal 2's gameplay: what has returned and been improved, and what is new. So let's take it right from the top. In regards to the returning features, you still find yourself navigating Aperture Labs both inside the conventional test chambers and the less clear backroom areas, solving puzzles, performing platforming challenges, and experiencing the story from the first-person perspective. You'll still utilize the portal gun and weighted cubes to navigate many obstacles as you strive to complete each test chamber, all while being given guidance by a number of Portal 2's characters. There's still a boss fight that acts more as a puzzle than a traditional encounter, secrets to find, and a physics engine to play around with and manipulate. The challenge chambers also make their return with the added feature of a leaderboard so you can brag to your friends that you beat a particular chamber in less time or with less portals used. Now for the new stuff. So firstly, there are several new elements to the test chamber puzzle solving for the player to utilize. Laser beams acting as a replacement for the energy spheres, redirectional cubes that can change the trajectory of those lasers, tractor beams allowing the players to move objects, light bridges that can act as both platforms and shields, aerial faith plates that can spring the player in the air, and my personal favorite, the repulsion gels. You get 3 flavors of those things, each with a different application. You get the Old Spice Shower Gel Blue, which allows you to bounce, you get the Nickelodeon Splat Orange, which gives you a speed boost, and you get the oh my god, I've seen too much gross fan art White that will create portable surfaces. These new puzzle elements are introduced chapter by chapter in the classic way that Valve always teaches the player about these mechanics. They introduce them in a safe, controlled environment, allowing the player to understand them before upping the stakes and adding the possibility of failure in subsequent chambers. Each of these mechanics essentially stays mostly confined to the chapters they're introduced in, with a few exceptions here and there, but the real fun starts to come in when we talk about the cooperative campaign. See, there aren't too many brain scratcher puzzles in the single player, since the primary focus is on providing an entertaining story while having the puzzles be just difficult enough to make the player feel like they're accomplishing something. The cooperative campaign definitely takes things a step further in the direction of difficulty. I wouldn't say anything here is too brain taxing, but there will definitely be a few points that will require players to stop and really evaluate all of the pieces of the puzzle, especially when it comes to the DLC chambers. The design philosophy behind these chambers was that they cannot be beaten by a solo player, and cooperation is a requirement in order to progress, meaning that every chamber pretty much requires 4 portals to be in use, and sometimes the 2 players will be separated, or they'll be put in an asymmetrical situation, or they will have to perfectly time something together in order to complete the challenge. The goal for the cooperative campaign is really team building, as you need to depend on each other to complete the puzzles. You get a ping system to communicate, GLaDOS will try to drive you and your partner apart to no avail, and most importantly, you get plenty of fun emotes to play around with your partner, such as playing rock, paper, scissors. Another scissors user, I'm so sick of the scissors meta. If you are looking for something a little more challenging, then oh boy do I have something for you. So in a post-launch update, Valve actually added in a level editor to make custom test chambers and allow people to share them on the Steam Workshop for others to play. Best part about this though is that there's a quick play feature allowing you to instantly get into one of these levels without having to scour through multiple other creations. You can also skip that level and immediately go to another if that one happens to be either uninteresting or too hard, which if you're like me will happen a lot because holy fuck are some of these creations difficult. Far harder than anything from the solo or cooperative campaigns, and since I'm too stupid to complete a lot of these, it's nice to be able to skim through them to find ones that I can actually play. The level editor for this mode is quite robust too. You essentially get an isometric view of a chamber that you can alter on the fly, change the aesthetics, and add essentially any puzzle element from the base game. It's a very in-depth system for what it is, a little too in-depth for me though. Yeah, I tried to make a couple of creations, but if you thought Wheatley's thrown together chambers were a mess, oh boy, you have not seen mine. I can obviously appreciate a system like this existing though, and if I had more time, I'm sure I could probably dive a little bit more into it. As it is now, this is just another massive addition to the game that I thought was already flawless. This takes a game that you'd realistically spend 10 to 12 hours on between both campaigns and essentially adds a never-ending supply of content for those that love Portal 2's gameplay. Portal 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. Obviously, by the length of this video, you know I can rattle on about how much I love everything about this game, but let me indulge just a little bit more one last time. I love everything about the presentation. The graphics are a noticeable upgrade from the first game, the soundtrack is phenomenally good, and the voice acting is once again perfection. The story has seen a massive upgrade in scope, with an expanded aperture labs, several new memorable characters, and some of the funniest dialogue and best environmental storytelling from any game. Finally, the gameplay took everything you loved from the first game and cranked it up to 11. The puzzles have a ton of new elements to experiment with, and with the additions of a cooperative campaign and a custom level editor, there is absolutely no shortage of content. Look, there are two different types of people in this world. Those who have played Portal 2 and those who have not. To those who have experienced this game before, there probably wasn't a whole lot of new information in this video for you, but hey, you just had some shitty YouTuber validate your opinions on this game, so congrats. To those of you who haven't played this game, which I know might only be like 5 or 6 of you, please do. I cannot recommend this game enough. It is an absolute must-play for anyone in my opinion, and with how cheap it is on Steam and how frequently it goes on sale, you are definitely not wasting any time or money when experiencing Portal 2. Well, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of Portal 2? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below, and hey, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.